Hello everyone, today's video is on Susan Eubanks, a woman who is still currently on California's women's death row in Chowchilla, California for killing her 4 sons.
Throughout history, there have been people who have committed some of the most heinous crimes fathomable. For those crimes, they have been convicted and sentenced to death. Welcome to Death Row Executions, where we take a look into the lives of society's worst offenders. And now, your host, Air.
Susan Eubanks was born on June 26, 1964 in San Marcos, California. She got married to her first husband, John Armstrong, and the two had one son together by the name of Brandon. Brandon was born in 1985. Susan's relationship with John did not work out, so the two of them got a divorce. Susan married a second time to a man named Eric Eubanks. When she got married to Eric, though, she was pregnant with her second child, Austin Eubanks. Although Austin shared Eric's last name, his biological father was a man named Larry Shoebridge. Susan was actually living with Larry before she decided to ditch him and elope with Eric. Austin was born in 1992. Eric stayed with Susan, and he fathered 2 more children with her. Brigham Eubanks was born in 1993, and Matthew Eubanks was born in 1995. Susan's brother ended up dying, so she adopted her nephew, and he was living with her, her husband, and her 4 sons. Susan and Eric's relationship was apparently stable at one point, but everything changed when Susan experienced job-related injuries that required surgery. Susan got hooked on prescription medication and alcohol. Her using caused her to lose her job. She and Eric began arguing constantly. They would separate and then make up and get back together. Finally, in fall of 1997, Eric could no longer take Susan, and he filed for divorce and moved out of their South Twin Oaks home in September of 1999. Susan was never alone, though. She always had a man or another one as backup. She met a man named Renee Dodson all the way back in 1994, and despite being married or in relationships, she continued having intimate encounters with Renee. As soon as Eric moved out of their family home, Renee moved in. Susan eventually got tired of Renee and kicked Renee out. While Renee was out, Eric moved back in. Eric stayed in the house from October 13th to October 19th. During that time, on October 16th to be exact, Susan went to a store to purchase deadbolt locks for her home. She told a clerk, who also happened to know Renee, that Renee had broken the lock on her door and she was buying new ones so he could not enter or get his quote-unquote effing stuff. She then told the clerk to warn Renee that she had just purchased bullets at a store nearby and one had his name on it. The clerk said that one of Susan's kids was with her and he said, "Mommy did buy the bullets, didn't she? Didn't she?" Eric finally had enough of Susan and he decided to move out for good. He moved out on the 19th. After he left the second time, Renee returned to the family home. On October 26th, Susan went out with Renee to a bar to watch a football game. Brandon stayed home to watch his siblings and his cousin. As Susan's eldest child, Brandon often thought about moving in with his father, but he always decided against it because he didn't want to leave his half-brothers behind. He knew that Susan would get high and drunk all the time and would attack him and his siblings with hurtful words. He was often kept out of school and football practice just so that Susan could go out and party. Brandon remained strong and protected his younger siblings and cousin. While out at the bar, Susan and Renee ordered a pitcher of beer and were then joined by another couple. Susan was not happy with the female in this couple sitting next to them because she and Susan had had a previous confrontation. The female criticized Susan for talking about Renee behind his back. Susan told Renee that they needed to go to a different bar because she was upset. The couple argued, and when they finally left the bar, Susan continued arguing with Renee, expressing that she felt he was taking the other woman's side. A few smacks from Susan while Renee was driving upset him so much that instead of driving to a second bar, he decided to drive home. He did not like the fact that he was assaulted in the face. Renee changed the course of his drive without informing Susan, though, and once she realized Renee was driving home and not to a different bar, she slammed the minivan into its parking gear while they were traveling about 30 miles per hour on a freeway off-ramp. She then removed the keys from the ignition, but Renee was able to retrieve them from Susan and drove home. Once the couple made it home, they continued arguing in the bedroom. Renee said that he was done with her and wanted to move to Hawaii without her. Angered, Susan assaulted Renee some more, took his keys, blocked his exit from the room, and ripped all of the telephones that were connected to the wall out. After being trapped in the room for some time, the couple finally calmed down and ended up having a sexual encounter. Renee then told Susan he was going to watch TV in the living room. It was all a trick though. Renee felt the only way to keep Susan calm was to go along with whatever she requested. When she wasn't looking, Renee fled the home and ran to a nearby gas station since Susan still had his keys. Once at the gas station, Renee called the sheriff's department and asked for them to send a deputy to stand by so he could retrieve his belongings and truck from Susan's house. Renee was not the only one to call for help though. Susan's eldest son, Brandon, left the house earlier when he heard Susan and Renee arguing. He left to find the nearest payphone and he called his best friend's mother, Kathy Gibbs. Brandon asked Kathy if she could come to his house to pick him, his siblings, and his cousin up because he was scared and did not want any of them to be exposed to fighting. Kathy ignored Brandon's cries for help and instructed him to go back home, reassess the situation, and to call again if he still needed her to pick them up. Brandon followed instructions, but because Susan and Renee were still arguing, he left the house again and phoned Kathy for a second time. Brandon pleaded with Kathy to come. Kathy reassured Brandon that she was on her way to come pick them up. Brandon calmed down and made his way back home waiting for Kathy. Little did he know, Kathy never left the comforts of her own home. She lied to Brandon and never had any intentions of picking him up. She did not call authorities to help him either. She claimed to have been scared that Renee would call the police on her if she came, and if anything happened, the kids would all be separated. Not only that, Kathy was allowing the boy's father, Eric, to live with her until he found a place to live, but she didn't even inform Eric initially about what was going on because she claimed to have been concerned that Susan would no longer allow Brandon to visit her son if Susan saw Eric at her house if she came by at a later date to pick up the boys. Back at the gas station, Deputy Sheriff Daniel Deese picked Renee up. Renee directed Sheriff Daniel to where Susan's house was, and when they made it to the house, Susan was carrying Renee's tools away from his vehicle. They also noticed that Renee's car had 2 flat tires and broken headlights. When Sheriff Deese told Susan to drop the tools, she immediately became confrontational and claimed that Renee owed her money and had sexually assaulted her. Sheriff Deese told her that if she did not comply with his request, he would arrest her. After hearing that, Susan ran into the house and locked herself inside. Once Susan was inside of the house, Renee got out of the sheriff's car, retrieved his tools, and put them in the patrol car. Susan had to have been spying from the inside because as soon as Renee did that, Susan came roaring out of the house. Renee told Sheriff Deese that everything was fine and he just wanted to leave. The two of them left, but they saw Eric parked nearby. Kathy had finally decided to inform Eric about Brandon's calls. She paged him and Eric immediately came to check on what was going on. Eric actually noticed the sheriff parked in front of Susan's house, so he chose to park somewhere else because Susan had an active restraining order against him. Eric decided to stay away until the sheriff left. Renee asked Deputy Deese if he could stop the car to talk to Eric. After learning that Renee no longer wanted to be with Susan, and Susan was putting his stuff out, Eric agreed to take Renee to a bar in Escondido. Renee took his tools out of the police car and placed them in Eric's truck. Back inside Susan's home, she telephoned her son Brandon's grandfather and then called Brandon's father, her ex-husband John. Susan told John that the police had been there investigating the incident with her boyfriend Renee because she slashed his tires, broke his windshield, and put sugar in his gas tank. She said that she was scared that CPS would come and take all of her kids away. She told John that she needed him to tell Brandon to quote-unquote, stick by me on this one, even if it means lying. After her conversation with John, Susan then called Eric, but he didn't answer. Eric and Renee hung out for a while, but Eric left after he received a voicemail from Susan that said, goodbye. Renee then informed him that Susan had told him that she talked about ending things for her and her boys. Eric left and made his way to Kathy's house. He arrived at Kathy's house at around 6 p.m., and he let Kathy hear the voicemail left by Susan. Finally, at about 6:30 p.m., Eric decided to call the sheriff's office and asked to speak with Deputy Deese. Sheriff Deese was able to connect with Eric at 7 p.m. Eric informed him of the message Susan left and about how he was concerned that Susan had a firearm in the house. Sheriff Deese instructed Eric to request a welfare check on Susan's house. Eric followed instructions, and police said they were on their way. In the meantime, Susan had absolutely no idea about Eric's call to police. She was in her own world and upset that none of her children's fathers had her back and men kept leaving her. She decided to get her .38 caliber revolver and do the unthinkable. She gave Austin and Brigham Xanax and shot them both in the head. Brandon and Matthew did not have Xanax in their systems, but they were fatally shot as well. Brandon was shot first in the living room in the temple and the neck. Matthew, Austin, and Brigham were shot in their bedrooms. Austin was shot in the head by the left eye from about a foot away. Brigham was shot from a few inches away 2 times, once above the left ear and another by his right ear. Matthew was shot on top of the head, leaving stippling marks on his face. Susan then removed the 5 expended shell casings, put them in a trash can, and reloaded the gun. Susan then shot herself in the abdomen with the same revolver. Her nephew, who was home during this whole ordeal, remained untouched. When deputies finally arrived at 7:30 at night, they knocked on the door, but no one answered. They heard faint sobbing from inside of the house, so they broke down the door. They entered the home and found 5 separate notes on Susan's bedroom floor. One letter was to Eric, and it said, "You betrayed me. You kept a diary, and you and Renee Dotson conspired against me. I've lost everyone I've ever loved. Now it's time for you to do the same. You can use any money from my workers' disability case to bury the kids and find your rainbow. Anna May, I'm sure." In a letter to Renee, Susan wrote that he was the biggest liar to date that she knew. "Stay on crystal meth and let your 37-year-old butt move back with mom and dad. Get back with Pam and or Sherry. They're your class. See ya, ha-ha." A third letter was addressed to Brandon's dad, John. "I know you'll hate me forever, but I can't let Brandon live without his brothers, so I did what I did. I have been strong for 25 years, and I'm tired of all the fight and hurt. Renee effed me all up." In the fourth letter, she addressed it to her niece. "I know what I'm doing is going to hurt you tremendously, but I can't and have no desire to go on." In the last letter, she addressed it to her sister. "I'm tired of being strong. Things are way out of hand." She included Matthew's birth date and hers, and asked her sister to ensure that the 2 of them would be in the same casket. Police continued searching the house. They discovered Susan's nephew in the bed alive and well with the covers pulled up to his chin. They saw Brandon, Brigham, and Austin all deceased. Austin was on the top bunk bed alone, and Matthew and Brigham were on the lower bunk bed together. Matthew was still breathing, so he was transferred to the Children's Hospital, but he died shortly after arriving. Susan actually attempted to shoot Matthew 2 times, but she missed and the bullets landed in the wall. When she finished shooting the others, she came back to him last and shot again. Susan was spotted with her abdominal injury in her bedroom, and she was transported to the hospital as well. In the ambulance, she received infusions of saline and other fluids, which affected the alcohol content of blood drawn when she finally made it to the hospital. When a blood sample was finally taken, she had a 0.07% blood alcohol level. Experts concluded that at the time of the murders, her blood alcohol level would have been closer to 0.20%. Valium was also found in her system. Dr. Smith let detectives know that the alcohol and drug levels in Susan's blood at the time of the shootings would have produced a very significant effect on her brain and would have affected her emotions, perceptions, judgment, and other higher brain functions. Susan was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder while she was recovering from her injuries at the Palomar Medical Center in Escondido. While cuffed to her recovery bed, she pleaded not guilty to 4 counts of murder. Her trial began in August of 1999. Susan's defense lawyer said that Susan blacked out as a result of drinking and being under the influence of prescription drugs. Her past heartaches and domestic disturbances caused her to become a quote-unquote robot, and she did what she thought would remove her pain. Prosecutors claim that Susan was not suffering from a blackout because she had to load her weapon twice before she finished, which gave her ample time to realize what she was doing and stop. They also claim that she only shot herself in the abdomen to increase her chances of a lesser charge. Prosecutors also brought forth witnesses to testify against Susan. One witness was Larry Shoebridge, Austin's biological father. Larry testified that he used to date Susan, and at one point they were living together. One day he answered a phone call from an ex-girlfriend back in 1989, and Susan got so angry She put a gun to his head and said, "I could do whatever I want. I could kill you." Larry got scared by Susan's words and actions, so he moved out as soon as she left for her next work shift. Susan eventually found out where his new place of living was, so she drove up to the house, screamed, and tried to attack the female friend that was with him. She finally gave up and drove off, screeching her tires as she left. Brandon's relatives and one of his friends testified about the impact Brandon's death had on their lives. Brandon's paternal grandmother said that she believed Brandon had been assaulted by Susan on a few occasions. Teachers and coaches of Brandon's also testified about the impact of his death on them. Linda Smith, Susan's sister, testified that she once received a phone call from Susan, and Susan told her that she had rubbed her nephew's face in a dirty diaper after she learned he had hidden the diaper behind his bed. Linda said she called Susan out and was angry with her, and realizing that her sister was not on her side, Susan changed her story and said she only made her nephew smell the diaper as punishment. Susan's other sister, Michelle Smith, reported Susan to CPS before, and she was quoted saying, "If CPS had listened to my calls, my sister wouldn't be in the hospital on murder charges, and I would still have 4 nephews." All she heard back from CPS workers were that investigators would look into it, but they never did. CPS dropped the ball. In August of 1999, after 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Susan guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder. After 2 days, they returned with the sentence of death. The judge agreed with the sentence in October of 1999, and Susan Eubanks was then transferred to the Central California Women's Facility for female death row inmates in Chowchilla, California. To date, Susan is still on death row and has not yet been executed.